He's going to talk about non-linearity, variability, and diversity. So thank you very much, Priyanga.
Oh, it's on. Okay. So just in case you had forgotten from yesterday 2 p.m., we are on this theme, but today is this is my last lecture. And what we are going to do is to draw on all of the concepts that I covered in the previous lectures and use them to address a practical problem. So, and also in the process, use some more sophisticated, somewhat more complicated mathematical techniques because the problem gets a little bit more complicated. So that's the plan, okay? So what I did yesterday, so we are on the topic of the interplay between non-linearity and temporal variation, and yesterday I talked about competition. So today we want to talk about consumer resource interactions. Now, in especially thermally varying environments, and you will see why in a second, okay? So temperature again is the abiotic dimension here. Now, so consumer resource interactions come in all shapes and forms. They constitute the building blocks of all communities, be they natural or agricultural. So it's very important for us to understand how they can persist in the face of different kinds of environmental perturbations. So we are going to focus on climate warming. There's no argument that this is the most severe environmental perturbation of our times, and we all have a responsibility, whether we are physicists, biologists, chemists, humanists, people who study humanities, to really be aware and to contribute in some way towards at least understanding, if not ameliorating this problem, but understanding takes you a small step towards finding solutions to at least minimize this problem, which I consider as a responsibility that we hold towards the future generations who might not live to see a planet. And I'm completely sincere on that. Okay. So there's a great deal of evidence, which I don't need to belabor, that climate change warming is causing phenological shifts, these shifts between consumers and resources, and disruption of consumer resource interactions. And this can lead to not just to the loss of biodiversity, but also a failure of biological pest control, which is of great importance to crop production and the economics thereof. So our goal is to develop a mathematical framework for predicting warming effects on consumer resource interactions. And we are going to focus on ectotherms because ectotherms, as we now know, are organisms whose body temperature depends on the environmental temperature, and they constitute the majority of biodiversity. They are all of biodiversity except birds and mammals, and they are the fundamental players in most of the consumer resource interactions we observe in communities, okay? Now the framework, I want to say a little bit about the framework, which is now different because we are addressing a different problem. So I am going to look at stage structured models. Why do I do that, which I haven't done before? This is because we want to, if you really want to ask questions about or answer questions about climate warming, you have to consider the developmental delays that characterize the life cycles of multicellular ectotherms. So what do I mean? So these organisms lay eggs, they develop through some sort of juvenile stage, larval, nymphal, into adults. There's a delay between when adults reproduce and when the next generation is formed. That time delay is important, especially in ectotherms, because that time delay is temperature dependent. When temperature varies over time, that time delay becomes both temperature and time dependent. So when temperature varies over time in in typical ways like seasonality, organisms can adapt so that they can maximize their fitness, and so their delay is the kind of delay that maximizes fitness. But when you have temperature varying in unpredictable or in human-induced sort of ways like climate warming, these organisms are not adapted to that. They cannot adapt that quickly. If they cannot, on the time scales that they cannot adapt to that change, what would be the outcome of temperature, these increases and changes in the temperature regimes on those developmental delays, and how do those impacts then translate into population dynamics and species interactions. So that is the rationale. And again, as before, we want to incorporate mechanistic descriptions of trait responses to temperature, which is a great deal more important in this question because we are addressing a practical problem where the degree of accuracy of our answers are much more important than if we were doing it for our own edification. So these, although I do this in a basic science perspective, they're not exactly toy models in the sense that you can make toy models, but if you want this to be relevant, then you have to use descriptions that reflect how the underlying biochemistry of organisms, multicellular organisms, responds to temperature. So you have to think about reaction kinetics, thermodynamics, all of those things, because that's what underlies what you see as the impact on the phenotype. And the other thing, the third thing is very important. You want to be able to predict what happens at the population or community level based on trait responses, which means you generate these predictions independent of the population level outcomes you see in nature, and so that you can then test your model outcome against the observed population level outcome. You're not using existing population or community level data to parameterize your model. So as I said the last time, that's a very powerful approach, and it is doable for reasons I'll explain and I will demonstrate. So the axis of investigation. So this is a big, climate warming is a global problem. You want to analyze it as completely as possible. So I'm going to look at the effects of latitude, so tropical versus temperate, the extremes of latitude, the life stage attacked. So does the consumer attack the juvenile stage or the adult stage of the resource? And the nature of consumer resource dynamics in the absence of warming. Are they stable in the sense of there is a fixed point, that's a point equilibrium, or do they exhibit complex dynamics? Now, as you all know, delays do lead to overcompensating density dependence and some sort of oscillatory dynamics. I mean, chaos is a very simple example. So an example of an the result of overcompensating density dependence. And here we have delays because that naturally arise because these organisms have the developmental process. So that's a really important thing. The delays come from the life history. We don't put in a delay and say, look, we get, because you can get the discrete logistic, as you all know, you can get the results of the discrete logistic model by adding some arbitrary time delay to the continuous logistic model. When you do that, you're just adding some term, right? Here the term comes from the biology and is something you can measure in this organism. And some of you in the audience have already done that, as have I. All right. And then what the warming scenarios, we are going to look at the latest IPCC predictions about warming. And these are that there are, and I will be more explicit about this later, the two main predictions are the winters are going to be warmer than average, the summers are going to be hotter than average, with the end result being on average there will be more hotter and more extreme hotter days than we've seen before. And we all understand that the summers are unbearable everywhere. So we all understand that. So we want to see how that affects in organisms that, unlike us, can regulate that. They cannot regulate their body temperature. And they cannot adapt on these time scales. Okay, so that's the context of our problem. We can look at adaptation, that's a secondary, that's the next problem. Right. So the approach, as I said before, is we want to predict population level outcomes based on how temperature affects the trait responses. And to do this, we have to characterize these trait responses. And I did this yesterday, so I'm not going to go over it in great detail. We have these two types of responses that are, either driven mostly by just the rate processes alone or through some negative feedback. And I call them rate controlled versus regulatory processes. And I showed you this, that the mortality rate above some critical minimum threshold is given by the Boltzmann-Arrhenius function. But, and I didn't show this yesterday, you can actually have mortality increasing below that critical threshold, and you use a modified Arrhenius function to depict that increase. Now, of course, with climate warming, we don't really care about that because organisms are up here, right? But to be actually accurately capture the biology that organism starts to freeze to death essentially at low temperatures. So all of the models here actually incorporate this modified function, okay? And the maturation rate, now you haven't seen this before. The maturation rate is given by this sort of left skewed function, which is a result of reaction kinetics and enzyme inactivation. So what happens is that rate processes on the left and right at extreme temperatures, these rate processes decline because of enzyme inactivation. But the way that happens, as I will show you later, is different. And that is why this decline is so much slower than this decline. So keep this in mind because temperature effects on development is crucial to predicting effects of climate warming on ectotherms. And ectotherms matter because they are most of the biodiversity. If all of those insects and worms and everything else goes away, there will be no world left. Okay, now, so and as I showed you before, the other type of response are these regulatory responses that are more symmetrically unimodal that we generally represent using a Gaussian. In fact, the data fit well, as I showed you yesterday, to a Gaussian function. And they are driven by negative feedback in these rate processes, and that matters a great deal as well. Now, so and as I said before, one advantage that we have is the biology is such that the qualitative nature of these rate responses are conserved across taxa, meaning whether they are exponentially increasing, left skewed, symmetrically unimodal does not change across when you go from insects to fish, let's say, or everything. This does not include microbes, when the microbes don't quite have that kind of life cycle. So you only have sort of like a growth rate, which is left skewed for reasons, because mortality is monotonically increasing and birth rate is a Gaussian. Okay, and as before, now our big question is, so how do these temperature effects that operate on the traits translate into the dynamics of species interactions? Now here, I'm using a different model because we are now very interested in the stage structure. So what we have is a situation where both the resource and the consumer have a juvenile stage and an adult stage. And of course, adults give birth to juveniles, juveniles mature into adults, they die along the way. The consumer can feed on either the juvenile or the adult stage of the resource, okay? So that's an important thing. So we allow that different feeding mode. Now what we are going to do is to develop stage structured models that explicitly incorporate those developmental delays that characterize the ectotherm life cycle. And then I want to just show you someone that maybe you don't know. If you don't, you should look him up. He's like right here. A long time ago, I came to teach in this very summer school when Renato was a teaching assistant, and we met and we talked about delayed differential equations, and we had this great collaboration, and we published some really good papers, and we're going to continue that. So I want to really acknowledge his inspiration and his help in developing this theory now, which we are now taking to the realm of addressing questions about climate warming. So here is the mathematical depiction of, this stage structured life cycle in terms of delayed differential equations. So now I'm going to go through all of that. This is like in fair detail, okay? So these are the equations for the juvenile and adult stage of the resource. Juvenile recruitment occurs through adult reproduction. This is just life history. This is just a balance equation. And how do losses occur? They mature into adults, that's a loss to the juvenile stage. Some of them die, right? If you look at the adult stage of the resource, then the input is through maturation. Losses are due to mortality and also consumption by the consumer. Remember, the consumer can attack the juvenile stage. Then these are the juvenile and adult stages. The consumer input to the consumer larval stage occurs through consumption of the resource, which gets translated into larval production. Losses occur through maturation and mortality. Now these M functions are the maturation functions that incorporate the effects of temperature and time on the developmental delay. These functions are crucial in predicting the effects of climate warming on these consumer resource interactions. So because of that, I want to go through them in a little bit of detail. So these models are quite a bit complicated. So I'm not going to go through everything, but there are a series of papers I can give you, and also from the early days from Roger Nisbet and Bill Gurney, who actually developed this theory for ecology. So if you're really interested in learning, this is not, it's the hard part is not writing the equations down. The hard part, as Renato could tell you, is in simulating them, translating them into code that would tell you, because they are non-autonomous and often also in certain situations non-stationary. So the maturation functions, essentially so just look at these terms. The tau term here is the time delay due to juvenile development. So we all understand, right? There's a time delay, and the big challenge we have is to mathematically represent that time delay in taking into account both the temperature and time effects. So that's why it's a T of T. S here, this function, this variable S is the juvenile survivorship during the developmental period. So what happens? Eggs start to develop into the adult stage, go through some juvenile stages. During all that time, some of them die, right? Fact of life. And then the little m here is the per individual maturation rate, okay? And that, then let me explain. So just note that these functions incorporate these three components. And it looks difficult, but all it is telling you is when they mature, these things happen, and therefore not all the eggs will develop into adults, and there would be some time between eggs develop into adults, and that time depends on temperature. And if temperature changes over time, then that will depend on. So it's a very simple, intuitive thing. If it's warm, they develop faster. If it's cold, they develop slower. If it's too warm, they drop dead. Okay? All right. So now, let's just work through this. So so think about it. Individuals that are adults at this time, at the present, were born some time units ago, which is when their parents reproduced, right? So in this equation then, this term is the birth rate, some time units ago, right, times the adult density at that time, which gives you the birth rate at that time. So this is the time at which these eggs are being laid, right? Then what happens to those eggs? Then there is so then they are going to mature, right? Those eggs are now laid, some time you need to go, and then between that time and now are when they mature, right? When they mature, what happens? Some of those eggs can die due to some density independent mortality, could be hatching failure or something. So this equation has three parts. Then you have a rate of maturation and a survivorship. Okay, so does everyone understand that? It's just simple biology. It just looks complicated because we have to add that maturation term here. Okay, so now, just to sum up, we have the birth rate or time units ago, the rate at which individuals develop from juvenile to adult, which is also a function, and the fraction of those juveniles then survive to adulthood. Are we following? Yeah. Now, the thing to note is when temperature varies over time, seasonality or warming, developmental delay, and juvenile survivorship are explicit functions of time. Now, so then we actually have to write down functions to describe how survivorship changes with time and how the time delay changes with time. This is why it's a bit more complicated than using a non-straight structured single ODE or pair of system of ODEs. So now we have the change in juvenile survivorship is given by these equations. That's for the resource and that's for the consumer. And these are the rate of change in the developmental delay. Now notice both of these have this ratio. And that ratio is the thing that we need. The others are death rates, right? These are juvenile death rates. This is the juvenile death rate now. This is the juvenile death rate, some tau units again. So remember that here the juvenile includes everything from egg to larvae, pupae, all of those for simplicity, because unless there's density dependence, they just act as a time lag. Okay? Now, so now let's go further into this. This ratio is the crucial thing. That determines temperature effects on maturation, which is development, right? So if temperature increases over the duration of the juvenile stage, this thing is greater than 1, right? Because temperature increases, that ratio exceeds 1. If there were 1, there's no effective temperature, right? So we understand if the maturation rate sometime time unit ago, tau time unit ago, and the maturation rate now at some time t is the same, that ratio should be 1. So right away you know that if it exceeds 1, stage duration is shorter. You're going to become an adult faster, right? This is pretty intuitive, right? We could just write it out in words, but then how would we predict the future? We can't without the equations. And if temperature decreases over the duration of the juvenile stage, that ratio will be below 1, stage duration is longer, and fewer individuals survive to adulthood. Is that clear to everyone? Is that sort of, all you have to follow is the logic. In these things, this is why I said the biology is what matters. Yes, those are sort of fairly complicated equations, but you can write them down and you can work through them. What matters is to understand what each term means, so that's how you are able to decipher, because this is now complicated. It will spit out a bunch of results, and you have to be able to understand what the results mean, okay? Actually, I can tell you when I was a graduate student, I used to study fixed delay models, and I thought the fixed delay models were hard. And now I think, oh, I can do fixed delay models in my sleep. It's the variable delay that's hard, because your mind gets a little clouded after a while. Okay, so we are now back to the model with a little bit more clarity on how the equations are written. All of it is simply the biology. Is a fairly complicated life cycle translated into somewhat sparse set of equations, more complicated than before, because we've added the complexity of the life cycle, right? So now we want to define the characteristics of the thermal regime. So first would be seasonality, which is the baseline, and then various climate warming scenarios. And we do this like this. We would say T of T is denotes temperature variation regime over the variation of temperature with time. And if you're interested in something like seasonality, then you have this sort of function where this MT is the mean temperature, AT is the amplitude, and we always do everything in Kelvin, because all those biochemical functions that define the trait responses are all framed in terms of thermodynamical quantities, okay? So AT is the amplitude of seasonal fluctuations. So this is for seasonal fluctuations where I am using a typical sinusoidal function. Now, if you knew the thermal regime of the location that you're interested in, you can simply substitute that for T of T and then go from there, okay? I am using something general, so I could get some general predictions that apply to different places. It's very flexible. That function could be something you get from your time series of temperature, okay? In fact, for my own insects, we fit something to the time series and get the parameters. And then this SFT is some sort of periodic function, and year is, of course, 365 days. So that's our baseline. With that baseline, then we incorporate climate warming. So as I said, I'm interested in testing these two new predictions, which you should be too, about the warmer than average winters and hotter than average summers. So to do that, we have this modified function. Notice now there's a new term here that's a function of time, and a new term here that's a function of time, which means simply that the mean and the amplitude are now going to change over time, right? That's what warming is, right? In fact, daily, on top of your natural seasonal variation. So m is the daily rate of increase in the mean temperature, which is given by this quantity, which I'll explain in a second, and a is the daily rate of increase in the amplitude, which is given by that quantity, which is exactly what we had before, except it's not T min and T max as in the seasonal regime, but the new minimum and the new maximum that's changing every day. Even by some small amount, warming means those things are changing every day. And we use daily rates because that's how we frame the model. We look at these organisms on a daily basis, per day basis. So then M low is the new low, new T min, which is a function of this, which is given by this function where S1 is the number of degrees by which the minimum temperature increases in some n years. That's where you have the flexibility to define your climate warming scenario and the time horizon over which you want to make a prediction, right? So most people actually want to make a prediction in the next 100 years because we really don't care what happens in a millennium. We might not be there. So, and also then you look at the IPCC predictions. What is it? How many people can tell me what the projected increase for this century is? You should look it up. It's 1.5 degrees Celsius at the minimum. Okay, it's very important to know this. And so you have these predictions from, you can take the IPCC predictions, you can take the predictions from your own time series if you collected them. Any region, if you look it up. So in the States, there's NOAA, there are airports, local, Sao Paulo airport probably has all of these things that you can get. And the time series itself is really interesting to study if you are interested in that sort of thing. And anyway, so then M high, the new high, is then given by the same thing, the number of degrees by which you expect the temperature to increase, and then the number of years that you're interested in predicting over. Now the warming scenarios. So we are going to consider these two warming scenarios that the IPCC has emphasized. So the warmer winters means the minimum temperature increases faster than the maximum temperature. What does that do? The mean increases, but the amplitude decreases, right? Then the hotter summers means that the maximum temperature increases faster than the minimum. That means the mean increases, but the amplitude also increases. And then you have the baseline where you have warmer winters and hotter summers of roughly the same magnitude, where the minimum and maximum temperatures increase at the same rate, then the mean and the amplitude increase at the same rate. Okay, now, so this is now, so we want to ultimately be able to get some predictions about how warming impacts consumer resource interactions. It's a hard problem because these equations you can't get analytical results for because they are non-autonomous. You have those delays. It's difficult. So, but we can get a lot of intuition, a lot of some useful information by looking at what happens to this system in a constant thermal environment. What's the only difference between a constant and a variable environment? The delay is now fixed, right? The delay is simply a function of temperature but not time. So let's look at this first. It's always useful to fall back on the thing you can understand analytically. I'm sure everybody appreciates that. So what I've done is to plot the, so what do you care about in a consumer resource interaction? that interaction will persist if the consumer will persist, right? The resource is going to do fine by itself. That's a different question. Yeah.
Sorry, I have a question on the
Yeah.
part. You were talking that you see this in the insects. Does it have any difference between a maduration that is discrete, pass from the juvenile state to the adult, from another type of organism that is constantly grow or the change?
Can you say that again? I missed the last part.
That is, if it's a difference in the model, if you have discrete steps of maduration like insects, from juvenile to adult, to something that is smooth.
So we did look at that at one point, and it doesn't make, so basically you're saying like it's like an integral differential equation.
Yeah.
So in the limit this will get to, like you can make it, and also because when because development is that left skewed function, it automatically sort of takes care of this problem. And I asked Roger Nisbet, who's the guru of all of these things, he said if it's extremely discrete, do not use this. But for most things, it provides a good approximation. The other option is to use just an integral difference equation, just like the way the integral projection models use for plants. Okay?
Okay.
All right. So we are mostly interested in the theory has mostly been, this theory has been developed for organisms with mostly continuous overlapping generations, but they do have a delay. Okay? So, all right. So here I have derived the consumer's persistence criterion for an unstructured model, just no structure, like yesterday, just a single ODE, sorry, a pair of ODEs versus the delay structured model. Okay? So notice that in the unstructured model, the consumer's persistence depends on the resource species birth and death rates, the resource self-limitation, consumer's death rate, and the consumer's functional response parameters, exactly what you would expect, which is what we had before in the models I talked about. But now notice when in the stage structured model, you have two additional terms. This is the resource species developmental delay, which is a function of its juvenile mortality and the delay itself. And this is the consumer species delay, which is a function of its own juvenile mortality. And so that you can see even in the constant environment, there's quite a big difference between the unstructured model with no delay and the structured model with this delay. So what we want to know is, what does it matter? Does it matter? So the important point is, so now if you look at it, first of all, what you can see very clearly is that the developmental delays reduce the consumer's viability through this multiplicative effect of juvenile survivorship and juvenile maturation. Does everybody see that? You're adding something to this side, and which makes it harder to satisfy that inequality. Obviously, that's a positive thing, right? Because you can't have a negative survivorship. And the second thing to note is a very interesting thing, and this really tells you about looking hard at these equations. This equation embodies the inherent difference between the sort of the features of the antagonistic interaction between a consumer and a resource, where the resource actually is harmed and the consumer is benefited by this interaction. They have an inherent conflict of interest. And we are going to see how that conflict plays out in how each species is affected by warming and how each species' response to warming affects the other species. Okay? So now notice, because it comes in as an additive term, the resource species developmental delay has a stronger effect on the consumer's viability than the consumer's own developmental delay, which comes in only in the exponent. That's a pretty significant result. So now, having discovered that, we want to ask, okay, what do these things, so let's look at these functions and try to understand how temperature affects them. And because you can see there are products here, this product is what matters, is the multiplicative effect of survivorship and mortality, juvenile survivorship and mortality. So be mindful of that, because that's going to matter a great deal. So we are going to now look at the temperature sense responses of traits that are going to affect viability, which are 4: attack rate, handling time, mortality, and maturation. Okay? And attack rate is the same as the birth rate because they are the same. Right. So here is a diagram that gives the temperature responses of those 4 traits, and the top row gives you the responses under typical seasonal variation. The purple here denotes the temperature range that species experiences under its typical seasonal variation. Okay? The second row and third row, these are for warming. The second row gives you the warmer winter scenario. The bottom row gives you the hotter summer scenario. Now, what you can see right away is warming reduces the attack rate and increases the handling time, but the strongest effects of warming are seen in the juvenile maturation and mortality functions. You can see that warming leads to a rapid decline in mortality. See now, sorry, this area is what the warming has now sent the species to. It's experiencing this new area, and this is the, so under warmer winters it's here, under hotter summers now it's actually experiencing this part of the thermal response. Now compare this to this. Now it's in this realm of a rapid maturation is rapidly declining with increasing temperature, and mortality is rapidly increasing with increasing temperature. And the effect is worse when summers are hotter compared to warmer winters. So what we see then is just by looking at trait responses, we haven't done any mathematics yet, it's just looking at these trait responses and asking how do the trait responses themselves, how are they affected by warming. What we see that maturation and mortality rates are the traits most strongly affected by warming. And we also see that hotter summers appear to be more detrimental than warmer winters because the maturation rate reaches its lowest and the mortality reaches its highest under that warming scenario. Right. Okay. So here we come to that question that I always am preoccupied by, but why? Why would that be the case? Why is it that mortality and maturation are the traits to be more severely affected by temperature and warming, warming compared to the consumption and birth rates? To answer that, we have to go back and look at the qualitative forms of these responses. So the rate control responses, you have either, so in development you have this left skewed response, in mortality you have this exponentially increasing response, right? So because they are really driven by just the direct effect of reaction kinetics and enzyme regulation. But if you look at regulatory responses, as I pointed out yesterday, they are more unimodal and symmetric because there's negative feedback that pushes the rate processes towards some intermediate optimum. So the point is that these shapes matter a great deal when you look at how warming shifts the thermal regime to the right. So I want to draw this contrast between the regulatory and rate control responses because that helps us understand why we see the outcome we do. So if you look at the regulatory responses, they exhibit a similar decline at low and high temperature extremes, right? Which suggests that why do they decline? There's some constraint, right? You freeze to death or you burn, you basically drop dead due to high heat death. So it's basically loss of protein denaturation and loss of respiratory function at high temperatures and freezing of body fluids at low temperatures. What you see is that what this suggests is that similar constraints appear to be at play at both low and high temperature extremes. If you look at rate control responses, the decline is much faster at high temperature extremes compared to the low temperature extremes, which suggests that different constraints may be at play in decreasing these rates at low versus high temperatures. Yes?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand if these things are being measured or if it's only biological
What do you mean by a biological consideration?
I think constraints, biological constraints that you can find, that you can
Sorry,
put on
are
the model.
you describing the function in terms of a biological constraint, or?
Yeah, no, I mean, these are only a biological background that you know about and that things that you can predict in the future, or is it these are things that are being served these days?
So these functions arise because of temperature affects the underlying biochemical processes. So they are enzymes, proteins,
Okay.
and all those kinds of things that happen in the cellular machinery. And those are described by thermodynamical equations using enthalpy, entropy, Arrhenius constants. And those functions that I showed you are derived from first principles of thermodynamics. And then what we do is we fit those models to the data to find that across all ectotherm taxa, these actual observed responses fit very well to the, so of course, even without doing that, we do know that they arise from the underlying biochemistry, and that's what I'm getting at. Now what this is showing is that those underlying biochemical constraints, protein unfolding or respiratory death, are different. Those underlying constraints may be different for these responses compared to those responses, and perhaps that might explain why we see this difference. Okay? Okay, great. So then, so indeed, if you actually look at the physiology underlying these things, low temperature declines typically occur due to things like freezing of body fluids, which is a slower response than high temperature decline, which occurs due to protein denaturation. First of all, that's irreversible, and also it happens very quickly. My favorite analogy for this is it takes time, even for humans, to freeze to death, but you walk into a fire and death might actually happen rather quickly, unless somebody pulls you out. But so the point is that then these rate control reaction norms then are likely to be subject to stronger biochemical constraints at high temperature extremes compared to low temperature extremes. And every single physiological study that has addressed this question finds indeed there is a lot of flexibility in the lower critical minimum temperature in these organisms. They are able to rapidly adjust it when a new thermal regime arises, but they are unable to change the CT max, the high temperature limit, because it's fundamentally you run against a wall. You run against the fact that once protein unfold, they cannot refold because it's permanent denaturation. Okay? So this is what's nice about this, that this brings in biochemistry, thermobiology, reaction norm, evolution, ecology, mathematics, all of those subjects to address this question. And I spent a long time when I started learning, I mean, I had a lot of biochemistry as an undergrad, but learning about thermobiology, 50 years of work where people had actually derived these things. So then we come back to our, so now that then actually we know why maturation and mortality rates are more affected by warming compared to the regulatory responses. And now with that knowledge, we can make some predictions. So what we do is we look at these rate responses, we make some predictions, we test it with the model. Okay? Even within the model, we have this predictive ability because we have the independent information from the traits. So we are going to say then warming is going to have the strongest effect on viability or persistence through the developmental delay, which itself occurs through the product of juvenile mortality and maturation. And we are going to predict that the resource species delay has a stronger effect on the consumer than the consumer species delay, because we saw from that analysis the resource species delay appears as a linear and additive term, whereas the consumer's delay appears only in the exponent in the denominator. That's the second thing. Third, because of the conflict of interest between the resource and the consumer, we would expect the resource to be negatively affected by warming, but positively affected by the negative effects of warming on the consumer, whereas the consumer will be negatively affected by direct effects of warming and the negative effects of warming on the resource. Isn't that beautiful that you have this conflict that gets inflated and a huge concern once you add this environmental perturbation. So those are our expectations. And what's really nice, I want to say, is that by careful consideration of the biology and the equations, you can come this far without actually having done any analysis of your model. So we are going to test these predictions along those axes I mentioned: latitude, life stage, dynamics, and the warming scenarios. Now, when we get to that time variable delay model, we can't do any analysis on it. We have to resort to numerical simulations. So this could be a nightmarish exercise because the parameter space is very large. What we do is we constrain it by looking at real species data from different latitudes and constraining it. We know that the mortality rate cannot be higher than a certain value because it wouldn't be physiologically possible. We know the birth rates of insects are like this or lizards are like this. So we can constrain the parameters. So you do not have to do endless explorations. So the biology can help you identify the relevant parameter space. Otherwise, you'll be doing this for like 10 years. Now, what I'm going to do is to show you a series of graphs that look like this, where the x-axis is time in days, y-axis is the log transformed abundance, and the black curve will depict abundance under typical seasonal variation. Increasingly brighter colors denote higher levels of warming. That's a cartoon. Now, let's first look at the effects of latitude. And I'm going to do this theorem proof style. I'm going to give you the answer and show how we came about it. So we are going to find out that tropical interactions are more at risk of species losses, while temperate interactions are more at risk of extreme fluctuations. Okay. And this here now, short of running a simulation that would take 2 hours, I can't actually show you how I got there, but this is published, and so you can actually go and read it. So here I have plotted the abundances, these time series of abundances for the resource species on the left column, consumer species on the right column, for hotter summers on the top row, and warmer winters in the bottom row. Now, what you can notice is that in the tropics, oh sorry, this is a tropical community, okay. So in the tropics, you can see that the resource persists even when the maximum temperature is 4 degrees, whereas the consumer goes extinct once the temperature goes above 2 degrees, okay. So there is definitely that difference between the resource species response to warming and the, but also notice the nature of the dynamics. They fluctuate seasonally or with some periodicity, but you don't see a signature of the kind of dynamics you see here, which is the exact same diagram for a temperate community. So here, again, resource consumer, hotter summers, warmer winters. You do not see any deterministic extinctions in either the resource or the consumer, but you can see that both species exhibit extreme fluctuations in abundance. Now, having said that, that's a qualitative statement. We can quantify it by calculating the coefficient of variation in abundances. What is that? How many people can tell me what a coefficient of variation is? Other than Jacopo, anyone else? Okay, that is, okay. You know any statistics? I'm joking. But so the standard deviation usually measures some index of variability, right? Oh, everybody knows that, I was joking. But the standard deviation is sensitive to the units. So if you are if you have large numbers, you're a butterfly, or I don't know, or compared to an elephant, then the numbers are different. So you standardize by the mean. That's the coefficient of variation. So here it's standardized for that, and what you can see is that the coefficient of variation in abundance in the temperate community is so much significantly greater. Now, let me explain here. On the y-axis is the warming regime, that's the seasonal variation, and these are the different warming regimes. That's tropical, this is temperate, resource consumer. Is here denote the deterministic extinctions that I showed you in the first graphs, where the tropical consumer goes extinct very quickly, but the coefficient of variation, and then the red bars are for hotter summers, blue bars are for warmer winters. The point here is the comparison between these two. The fluctuations are much more, we see statistically, they are significantly greater than those in the tropics. Then let's look at this other axis, which is the life stage that the consumer attacks. Yes, Bill.
If you go back to the example you're showing us, you get, in the temperate regime, you get coefficients of variation order 1. But if I was reading the previous slide correctly, in some ways it's even more extreme than that, right? You have order of magnitude. I mean, if these are natural laws, right?
Yeah, it is.
Then the low points of the population are a factor of 10 down, right?
Yeah, it is higher now. You can't quite see. This is still 1. Look, this is the abundance above is 1, and here it's also 1 on this side. So they're not that different. It's the minimum that's different.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah,
sorry.
Minimum.
The
so
minimum.
It's actually, but you can also see on this side, this is below 1 and this is almost 3.
No, I'm not worried about the actual numbers of the coefficient of variation. What I was worried about was that if you have the population falling by a factor of 10 for some time, if I imagine that you left something out of the model, I feel like if the population varied, plus or minus 50%, then I left some things out of the model. If I put them back in, they change things quantitatively. But somehow, if the population regularly falls by an order of magnitude, I can imagine that if I added some extra terms to the equations, I could actually drive it extinct much more easily. Is there a way of talking about, I don't know, structural stability in the equations or something that would allow you to say something about that?
You can do that. The reason I have not done that is because they are really they're differential equations, and you can also put in extinction threshold and say, well, they did actually go extinct, right? I'm not doing that because I want to compare what the model gives you with the tropic, because if I did that, that's my artificially imposing an extinction. What I want to show here is the fluctuations are real, because you do see the more extreme fluctuations because of the conflation of the seasonal variation with the nonlinear temperature responses. So in the tropics, you have very little variation. So that's the thing I talked about yesterday. There is an interplay between the nonlinear dynamics, seasonal variation, and the nonlinear temperature responses. So in fact, with warming, you also have, so you have this kind of, there's like a resonance effect of things being amplified when you have more variation and more nonlinearity. And I wanted to capture that, so I didn't impose an extinction threshold. You can ameliorate that by saying, oh, well, they don't go that low, for example. Right? You can simply say, well, in a real population, they wouldn't go that low. But I also used parameter values that are realistic for these insects, which actually means, which I will get to in my sort of bottom line, is that they could go extinct due to demographic stochasticity at any time, because they go arbitrarily close to 0, okay? And I'll get to that in a second. So, but because this is a deterministic model, I wanted to be sort of honest about not imposing something, just given the realistic parameter values. Okay, so that's the, okay, so then the life stage attacked, you can also see that when it's a different dimension. So here, so now we are looking at juvenile versus adult. So the same picture now, resource consumer, hotter summers, warmer winters, this is the juvenile stage that's being attacked. And you do not see any extinctions, even when the maximum temperature, is increased to 6. Then, if you look at now the consumer attacking the adult stage, exact same thing, exact same scenario, exact same latitude, but now the only difference is the consumer is attacking the adult stage. And now you see much greater fluctuations than you saw in the, when the juvenile stage is attacked. So you want to ask why? Well, okay, and also then let's actually look at that, and you can see the variability in abundance is much lower when the juvenile stage is attacked as opposed to the adult stage. Notice that in all cases, especially in the tropics, the consumer exhibits more variability compared to the resource. Okay? Now, so we want to ask this question of why is warming more detrimental when the consumer attacks the adult resource? So here's the explanation. Remember, the strongest warming effects occur on juvenile maturation and juvenile mortality, right? That's where warming really hits the life cycle. What that means is then, oops, we have a smaller adult population at the end of the life cycle. Smaller population, the consumer can overexploit the population and leading to large fluctuations. When the consumer attacks the juvenile stage, the invulnerable adult stage acts as a buffer. This is very well known in stage-structured population dynamics. The adult stage sort of averages over. That's kind of like your buffered population growth in a stage-structured life cycle. So that is to be expected just simply based on the life history. Now, the next one is we want to look at consumer resource, so effects of warming when the consumer resource dynamics are initially inherently more stable than when they exhibit complex dynamics. Now, the complex dynamics here come from the delay. So let me explain this. What are the steady state outcomes of these delay systems, these kind of systems where you look at the stage structure in the absence of any temperature variation? And these are the outcomes you get. If the developmental delay is short relative to adult longevity, then you get a stable equilibrium in these systems. And these are well known from decades of study for all kinds of different delay systems. And this makes sense, right? Long delay relative to adult longevity, you get delayed feedback cycles. That's what you get in chaos. That's what you get in any time you have a delay that leads to overcompensation or undercompensation in the density dependence. So that's to be expected. And here what happens here is that now we have this delay in this situation when you have the developmental delay intrinsically large because of the species life history. Some species have long developmental stages relative to the adult stage. Butterflies, lots of insect parasitoids, they have a very long larval or juvenile stage and the adults live for a few days. So in situations like that, you can get these delayed feedback cycles. Now the thing is, the interaction between these intrinsically generated delayed feedback cycles and temperature variation can increase the fluctuations, sort of this added nonlinearity and the sort of like almost like a stochastic resonance, except you have no stochasticity, can predispose these species to extinction. So here we are looking at the situation where the consumer resource dynamics exhibit delayed feedback cycles in the absence of any temperature variation. And now we ask what happens when you have seasonal variation and climate warming. And it is for a temperate community here and hotter summers and warmer winters. The thing to notice is now we see resource species extinction for the very first time. Under no other scenario did we get resource species to go extinct, but now we have the resource species going extinct. Under the hotter summer scenario, the consumer goes extinct even with a 1 degree increase in the temperature. Under the warmer winter scenarios, the consumer goes increase once the temperature increases by 2 degrees. So the last thing we want to ask is about this prediction, the IPCC prediction. Are hotter summers more detrimental than warmer winters? So let's look at this last case. So here I have plotted the number of extinctions of number of consumer extinctions as a function of the warming regime for tropical and temperate habitats, latitudes, and the black bars are for hotter summers, white open bars are for warmer winters. We can see that hotter summers need to more consumer extinctions than warmer winters. And that is, we are not talking stochastic, we are talking about deterministically the consumer cannot survive. Now, and then if you look at the coefficient of variation in these situations, what you see is that, so this is very interesting. In the tropics, you do see so in the tropics you have so many extinctions that the difference between hotter summers and warmer winters is not as apparent, because there's no winter and no summer really, you just have uniformly increased temperature. But in the temperate zone you do see the difference, but look at the difference between the resource and the consumer. The consumer is more differentially, more strongly affected by these two climate warming scenarios compared to the resource. And that is because, remember, the resource positively benefits from any negative effects of climate on the consumer, whereas the consumer has this double disadvantage of there's warming and then there's warming effects on the resource. All right, so now it's a bit puzzling though, because warmer winters has been really explained to be the phenomenon underlying this widespread phenological asynchrony we see in many organisms, where winters are warmer. What does that mean? Organisms emerge earlier, right? They are now emerging much, much earlier. There's lots of evidence, even in birds. They're all over Europe, UK, United States, everywhere in the world, they're emerging earlier in the winter. So that, if that is true, then why are we finding this different results? So what's really interesting is that focus on warmer winters. So you say, yes, they emerge earlier, but then what happens is, if the winter is warmer than average, what can you imagine about the summer? Summer is a great deal hotter than average, and that means there's a steep decline in birth and maturation and a large increase in mortality during hotter summers, compared, as I showed you before, in the trait responses. So that means there is a very large decline in summer abundance, and to the extent the hotter the summer, more difficult it is for species to recover from that heat-induced decline in abundance. What you're seeing increasingly is that population growth is sort of restricted to early spring and late autumn, in the middle being simply, there are these bimodal patterns being generated when there were no such patterns before, because summers are simply too hot. Now, to give you an example of this, I'm going to show you very quickly the phenological shifts in a single species using a time-dependent delay differential system. We have just one species now. So here's the typical seasonal variation in this particular case for a Mediterranean type species, sort of temperate Mediterranean. Notice that in this particular species, it doesn't matter what this is, what warming does to this basic pattern is what matters. So, but in this particular case, you have a spring peak and a summer peak. Now let's look at what happens. Then there's a 3 degrees increase in the mean annual temperature. I've just given 3 degrees so I can show you a fairly sort of a clear picture. So now you can see that the spring peak has advanced by 19 days, but there is also a delay in the summer shift by about the same magnitude. This is because the warmer temperatures in the summer reduce the maturation rate and increase the mortality rate. Remember, maturation increases with temperature only up to a point. After that maximum is reached, if the environmental temperature is higher than that, maturation will actually decrease, and very fast. Now, if you have a 5-degree increase in the mean annual temperature, you can see that the temperatures are so warm that there's literally no development, and mortality is so high that summer abundances are so low that it takes a long time for the species to recover, and recovery only happens after the temperature has declined to a level at which it can function, assuming it hasn't gone extinct here. So the population growth is increasingly concentrated in early spring and autumn. That is just to show you what happens when summers are very warm. That is the phenological shift. We focus on the early emergence, we talk about that, but we don't ask what happens to those things that emerge early when the summer comes. There's surprisingly few data, empirical data on that. Right. So, and now we see why hotter summers could be more detrimental than warmer winters. All right, so let me summarize the results here. We find that from using these combination of trait responses and then putting those trait responses into this model of delay differential equations, we find that tropical interactions, tropical consumer resource interactions are more at risk of species losses, while deterministic species losses, while temperate interactions are more at risk of extreme fluctuations. And we find that warming is more detrimental when the consumer attacks the adult resource and when consumer resource dynamics exhibit complex dynamics in the absence of warming. And we find that hotter summers on average tend to be more detrimental than warmer winters, especially to the higher trophic levels. Now there are some broader implications of this that I want to touch on, because it's really a practical problem. It's very interesting actually to look at these, how biochemistry affects these things, think about constraints, but this is also a practical problem we are facing today. And what can this, even this more sort of basic scientific research, what can it say about things that matter? So for biodiversity, what we find is across the board, ectotherm consumers are at high risk of extinction due to warming. These could be predators, herbivores, parasites, but what is really interesting is there is a latitudinal difference in the nature and timing of these extinctions. In the tropics, you would expect to see deterministic extinctions that would lead to immediate disruption of species interactions. The consumer would go extinct, you have no more interaction. In the temperate zone though, there are no deterministic extinctions unless you sort of impose it, which means that the species, what happens is if fluctuations are greater than what is observed on the ambient temperature, the species are more likely to go extinct due to demographic stochasticity during periods of low abundances. What that means is we don't exactly know when they would go extinct. So the effect of warming might be actually operational much later than you might expect, and that means the disruption of interactions will occur with some time delay. How many people know the term extinction debt? And this work done by David Tillman, among others. So this is a case of an extinction debt, that what happens now, the impact, the effect of climate warming now will be felt at a later stage when you may not expect it and you may not actually be able to attribute the cause. Now, I also want to talk about biological pest control, which is a very, very important issue. It's a human, it's actually again, perhaps a much more we talked about how to talk to non-scientists. Here's a place where you can push people's buttons. So what biological pest control is an alternative to pesticide use that's safe, effective, reduces pollution, reduces disease risk of cancer and all of those terrible things that happen. Now, what could happen, and it's very successful across the world, what could happen is we see that consumers are more, natural enemies are more at risk of extinction than and their prey, which means that warming-induced loss of natural enemies could lead to pest outbreaks and generate food shortages that could actually compromise the Earth's food supply. Now, we see from this study that pests whose adult stages are attacked are more likely to lose their natural enemies, especially in the tropics, and the tropics are very hugely agricultural, as we know. And we also find that pests with invulnerable adult stages are less likely to be impacted by warming and are going to be then more likely to resist biological control effects because they are better off under warming compared to their natural enemies. And lastly, most importantly, the failure of biological control means increased pesticide use, greater pollution, and a compounding of the existing environmental problems. So I'm going to stop here, which is right about time. Yeah, and then we will have a break and answer questions, right?
Thank you. I think, so we are a little bit late. I think it's a good idea to skip the break just because we will have lunch right away, and then we don't have to cut either lunchtime or we don't finish super late on a Friday, which I think is not the best idea. So maybe we can have questions.
I'm happy to.
And then
just go for lunch.
We have more time for lunch. Yes, so there is any question? Yes.
Priyanga, thank you again for this awesome lecture. And I was actually yesterday reflecting on the broad idea that biodiversity can be due to like three main like aspects, which and in the situation of the plankton biodiversity, which is unexplained, do you have any idea or suggestion or like work on this, and which of these aspects would be responsible for that biodiversity?
Do you mean the non-linear?
Yeah, the plankton paradox. They are.
Yes. So that's a very interesting and tough question, because people would disagree on that. Some people would say it's this, and some people would say it's the other. That is why I look at it differently, and I say that it's this interplay. And as I was saying yesterday, I don't argue that the interplay increases diversity; it just influences in one way or the other. And I think what we have to, if I have to say, in the what people call the Anthropocene, this age of man, this time we live in, what you have to really worry about is that there are these environmental perturbations like climate warming, or these things that are actually very nonlinear in themselves and unpredictable also. Although it's a trend, it happens we know that we get very cold days in the summer and very hot days in the winter. We have increasingly unpredictable events, and what you can expect is the interaction between those and the nonlinearities inherent in species' own responses to temperature, as well as the dynamics of species interactions, is going to lead to these kinds of emergent properties. But I think that interplay is ever more crucial now, understanding something about it, to then to say something about the fate of biodiversity in the future. Now, I'm speaking as a basic scientist. If you spoke to someone who actually deals with preservation of biodiversity, it becomes a harder question. What do you do now? And what is it that you can do at this very moment? And there's I might actually put it up. There's a really nice article in the New York Times, 2 articles. One is about what can you do about climate change. Second is the new climate diet. And it says everybody can make a difference. Pick one little thing and keep doing it. So I think, so from an applied perspective, I still think this is very far. I'm trying to, so the UCLA has this, Center for Climate Change, but they talk about just oceanographic models. And I think we have to also generate dialogue between biologists, people who do this kind of work, which is us, and people who do that kind of work, to put it together so we can make more predictive, statements about biodiversity. I'm not sure I answered your questions quite correctly, but.
So, more questions, please.
Thanks. Do you consider the prediction will be different if you consider some global patterns in climate like ENSO or?
So that's a larger scale, yeah. So if you then you have to ask, how has that changed under climate warming, right? And then what you would do is you would have another, what does it operate on the time scale of 10 years? I forget, no, it's longer. Yeah, so then you just simply superimpose that on top of this. But you have the baseline, right? And then you say, okay, now if I have ENSO, but ENSO is also changing.
But yes, adding that complexity will change then, because we're dealing with non-linearity, so.
Yeah, but you don't know how it might change. It might actually buffer it because you have something at a larger scale that absorbs something that happens on a smaller scale. I don't know. That would matter more to organisms that are longer lived. It wouldn't matter to anything with a lifespan of 1 year, right? So it would depend, say large, long-lived mammals and birds might be affected by that, but then the effect on other species would be simply the smaller scale effect translating into the larger scale effect and eventually being felt across several generations, many, many, many generations. But I think what's useful about this is that gives you a baseline. You know what would happen under any climate, any seasonal scenario you're interested in. You can get your mean and fluctuations and incorporate that. And you can ask, well, this kind of warming scenario, or you can add something more complicated and ask what happens. Then you can ask, well, what about the larger scale, NAO or ENSO or NAO, Northern Atlantic oscillations. Now, I do think that they may matter more in the aquatic realm than in the terrestrial realm, although I could be wrong about that. Yes?
So as you say about baselines, then you have these fluctuations around this baseline. What worries me are actually extreme events. And do you think, if you want to incorporate these, do you think it can be in this scheme, or would you have to set up a different equation with a different baselines or something else?
So that becomes a technical question. These delay equations are very sensitive to things you put to them. So you run into numerical difficulties. That actually is our next step. And in fact, I'm right at the crossroads of trying to decide, should we just go to ODEs and ask about extreme events without state structure, rather than try to, because these are sensitive, you have to work around the numerical problems. You have to make sure with so many non-linearities that what you're seeing is actually true and not a numerical artifact. And so there's a trade-off, but you also see at the same time, temperature really affects maturation, right? Most of those effects would disappear if you just had attack rates and handling times or birth rates. So it's an important question. I think what we might do is to try some small amounts of stochastic, sort of like basically imposing some unpredictability into the regime and see how the model reacts. So it's really it's not undoable, it's certainly very important. It's not these kinds of things. You do have, as I said, you have these odd events happening in the middle of an otherwise different regime, but it's a matter of the accuracy. Is sort of basically a technical issue of can you
but
get.
It may be also true that instead of relying on numerical accuracy and being dependent on this, that maybe if you start from a different baseline for different scenarios and then look at that instead of having the whole model go over
Yeah, you're right. That's the thing. I think perhaps the smartest thing to do is to go back to something I did yesterday, which is just an ODE with 2 consumers, right? You ask, well, what about warming in this situation and extreme, not warming, because it's much easier to do that sort of thing at the stochasticity, and then learning something from that but that is really my next step. That's what we are going to work on.
Some more questions?
I'm curious about what happens. Well, in some parts of the world, we're getting colder and colder winters, right? So I was wondering about that situation. What happens when you have a hotter summer but a colder winter in extreme climate zones?
So it's very interesting. So I looked up the IPCC predictions, and they say there'll be colder days, but on average, the number of colder than average days is smaller than the average number of hotter than average days. But it doesn't mean it's not getting colder. It's just that they're considering I use theirs because it's the most reliable sort of, or the kind of the mainstream thing. But I would like to actually, that has occurred to me as well, because you do have polar vortexes and you have all these.
I think it may be taking local data of some regions
Yes.
instead of the ICC complete.
I think that would be, so basically the thing I'm interested in, what if winters are colder and summers warmer, right? Sort of not both going this way. So basically an increase in amplitude. So yes, so that's also an interesting next step. Someone else?
More questions? Next one.
I was curious about the, you mentioned the, wait a minute. The reasonable parameters that you could find on the literature, then you could constrain the, which values you would test. How was this? Where do you find the parameters for?
For insects and arthropods, people have spent decades measuring all these responses, and they report them in the literature. So if you go through the literature, you can, so people I know, and including one of my own former students, has amassed these huge databases where you have everything from phylogeny, latitude, longitude, what happened to them, when they came, all of these data available. It's also available for lizards, not as widespread, but lizards, some fish. So you can use that information to constrain the parameter space. It depends on what you're interested in. So some people, if you're interested in like lizards or populations, then you want to go to a different database. But there are these now, what is it called, trait? I forget what it's called, but it's got every conceivable ectotherm data things. Data, I mean, all the data that anybody's ever published. So.
Thank you.
What's it called? The one that Van has. Van Savage and his group has this trait
something,
I forget.
So more questions, comments as well? We still have time, so even if there are no questions, we will stay here.
No. Oh, I did want to say one thing. So I'm leaving this evening. I'm happy to talk to anyone who wants to talk between now and when I have to take a taxi to the airport, which will be like 5:30.
So if there are no more questions, please let me.
Oh my gosh, I finally earned my
small appreciation. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for your course. And we'll get back at 2:15. Okay, so we don't delay a lot the end of the session today. And sorry, there is a Mac here since yesterday. I don't know if someone forgot it. It's Stefan. Okay. Small appreciation.
Hi.
Let me ask you, this model you showed us, you